Our next presentation will discuss the results of a real-world analysis on the impact of broadening eligibility criteria for clinical trials in patients with advanced non-small cell lung cancer. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Donald Harvey, who's director of the Winship Cancer Institute of Emory University's Phase 1 Clinical Trials section in Atlanta, and he will present the findings.
Good morning. Thank you, Rich, and thanks to the ASCO Organizing Committee for selecting this abstract for presentation on the impact of broadening trial eligibility in advanced non-small cell lung cancer, a real-world analysis. This work and this analysis came out of a project between ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research that created and crafted a set of recommendations for broadening eligibility criteria, and that group included a number of stakeholders, including patient advocates, the FDA, sponsors, and investigators, among others. We believe that broadening trial eligibility will allow more patients to participate in clinical research, that data that's generated will then be more generalizable to the population of individuals we see in the clinic, and that it will accelerate accrual to these trials and optimally bring new therapies to patients more quickly. These recommendations were published in a series of papers in the Journal of Clinical Oncology in 2017. They led a lot of different groups, brought forward different attributes of these recommendations. The ASCO TAPER study, as an example, already uses these broader criteria, for example, age range down to 12. The FDA has stated that sponsors may be able to enroll these broader populations and analyze them separately. Other groups, including the NCI and cooperative groups, are starting to implement these recommendations across different areas with broader criteria, and the FDA has issued draft guidance documents for commentary. The primary objective of this analysis was to demonstrate the impact of broadened criteria versus traditional criteria on the eligibility of patients with advanced non-small cell lung cancer. The outcome measures were the number of patients that were excluded by traditional versus these broadened criteria, and the characteristics of those populations and cohorts who would be eligible by traditional versus those broadened criteria. It was a retrospective study on real-world data of an 8-year period between January of 2011 and December of 2018. The data set was the ASCO CancerLink Discovery data set of de-identified electronic health record data. It was conducted in advanced non-small cell lung cancer patients because these are patients with advanced disease and comorbidities may also be common. It's certainly scientifically relevant because we have many trials available for this population of patients. And just as importantly, the data was curated within CancerLink Discovery, allowing for an analysis. The inclusion criteria was advanced non-small cell lung cancer stage 3A or higher, patients who had received therapy for systemic disease. 3 of the eligibility criteria were used for the analysis as part of the group's recommendations from 2017. The 3 areas were prior and concurrent cancers and presence or absence of those cancers, presence or absence of brain metastases, and then kidney function. Specifically, historically, criteria mandated that patients with creatinine clearance of 60 or higher would be eligible for studies. The new recommendation suggested that criteria should be lowered to 30 mils per minute of creatinine clearance. This translated to the data that was analyzed by including all cases of patients with a prior or concurrent cancer, allowing eligibility of patients regardless of presence or absence of brain metastases, and then finally including patients that had renal function of a creatinine clearance of 30 mils or higher. This is the data set. 10,500 cases were selected by traditional criteria for brain metastases. 21% of patients were excluded. Patients who had prior or concurrent cancers, 14% were excluded by traditional criteria. For renal function, patients were excluded with creatinine clearance lower than 60 mils per minute at a rate of 21.5%. Overall, that excluded just under 48% of patients in the cohort. When broadened criteria were applied, no patients were excluded due to brain metastases or prior concurrent cancers, and patients excluded for creatinine clearance dropped from 21.5% to 1.5%. Overall, this increased the number of patients that would have been eligible for a trial from 5,495 to 10,346. Age groups that were represented in these cohorts were altered slightly, particularly in the group of patients above 75 years. Those patients went from 16% of the traditional cohort to 22% of those in the broadened criteria. Patients in geriatric oncology and older patients are underrepresented in trials overall, so expanding these three criteria will increase that population by 6%. The limitations to our data are here. The generalizability of these results were not assessed. These were 50 sites within the CancerLink practices that are geographically diverse in generally non-academic settings. It was difficult at times to match trial eligibility criteria to EHR structured data within the health record. We simplified the brain metastases definition of presence or absence, implemented a rule to consider the primary cancer code at the likely metastatic site, not as another primary cancer, which affected less than 1% of the overall population. And similarly, performance status is not routinely reported in EHR structured data, making that eligibility criteria more challenging to analyze. Also, the analysis was not inclusive of all of the ASCO and Friends recommendations from the papers published in 2017, for example, HIV status, other organ function, and age. In conclusion, the use of expanded criteria would enable nearly twice as many non-small cell lung cancer patients to consider participation in clinical trials. These broadened criteria are likely to result in participants that are more reflective of the patients we see in clinics, improving generalizability of the data from these trials. Narrower criteria to exclude patients should only be used based on compelling scientific rationale, and additional ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research recommendations are currently in progress. At this point, this group urges all clinical trial sponsors to adopt these criteria. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Don. So I'd like to turn now to Dr. David Graham, one of ASCO's experts, to make some additional comments.
Thank you, Dr. Shilsky and Dr. Harvey. This is another report showing that big data can be used to highlight ways to better fight cancer. Using data gathered via the ASCO CancerLink program, Dr. Harvey and his colleagues have identified ways to more than double the patients eligible for lung cancer trials. So why is this important? The history of pediatric oncology clearly has shown us that remarkable advances can happen when large numbers of patients are entered on clinical trials. We really need to work to remove any barriers to doing the same in the adult realm. The days of my having to tell my lung cancer patients who also happen to have a clinically insignificant prostate cancer or a breast cancer that is likely cured, that they cannot be a part of advancing lung cancer care should be eliminated. These data, discovered only by leveraging the data available through the ASCO CancerLink program, will help us provide even more breakthroughs and hopes for our patients.
Thank you so much, David. I think it is important to point out, and if you read the fine print on the first slide, you will have noticed that I'm a co-author on the abstract, but I had nothing to do with its selection into this press briefing. But I do want to point out that we only looked at 3 exclusion criteria of what are oftentimes literally dozens of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So I don't want you to walk out of here thinking that by rolling back these 3 exclusion criteria, suddenly 98% of patients with lung cancer are going to be eligible for clinical trials. There are still many other reasons that a patient could be excluded. But that said, I think the study also illustrates the real value of thinking through very carefully what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are, not having arbitrary exclusion criteria that really simply limit a patient's access to a study and not based on any sound scientific or clinical rationale. So we're quite pleased to see that our advocacy for these changes is actually very well supported by this analysis. So that said,